CNBC-TV18 Digital India Vision 8.0 in partnership with Google Workspace.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for the minister. He's flown in straight from Bangalore to be here with us for the Digital India Vision 8.0. Mr. Chandrasekhar, this is the 8th year that we're doing this, really charting out the digital journey and the digital roadmap for India. You know, before I talk to you about some of the nitty-gritties that we will get into, let me get a sense from you on what transpired in Bangalore at the G20 meetings. There's a lot of expectation that during the course of the ministerial that India will present a governance framework for digital public good infrastructure, a definition for digital public good as well. Take us through what has transpired and how confident and optimistic you are about future global collaborations.
So Shereen, thank you for having me over this evening, and thank you for that first question, which is certainly a breaking news question. I can see that. But look, I think the ministerial declaration will be something that we have to wait and see what comes out tomorrow. And I certainly don't want to second guess that or preempt that. But I certainly can tell you with all the bilaterals that we have been having before today and leading up to today, that the India story over the last 9 years and how Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji's vision of these DPIs, digitizing government, and how that has transformed the entire paradigm of governance is something that certainly every country today is interested in adopting, following, and recreating in their own governments, in their own countries. We have, as you know, already signed about 8 different MOUs, India and other countries, to transfer this open source, very flexible framework of the India stack, which is the DPI that India has built. But I think more than the technology and more than the stack and more than any of that, the innovation, the power to empower that these DPIs represent is certainly something that has caught the imagination of most countries in the world.
You know, speaking of catching the imagination of most countries in the world, and I know I can't preempt the ministerial statement, but give us a sneak peek, if you will. Is there consensus on the broad principles as far as the governance framework is concerned? Is there consensus on financing as well? I mean, what are the key aspects that you believe we could see consensus emerge on?
Look, under the Indian presidency of the G20, I think most of what India is saying as the president of G20 and to the G20, countries of the G20, and indeed countries outside that as well, who are invitees to it, is simply something that is, something that is very deeply acceptable to countries, which is when we say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that as you apply to the tech space, says that we really believe that digitization and the power of technology should be available to the global south as much as it is available to the larger countries. That the narrative for several decades that technology and innovation were rooted in some countries and some companies needs to be transformed, where more and more open source platforms make it possible for even the smallest country to have durable ambitions of becoming digital nations, creating digital economies for themselves. So I think that message that India is giving in this G20 presidency, that message backed by our own case study, if you want to call it that, over the last 9 years, is certainly, I think, something that's going to be reflected in the ministerial declaration tomorrow. I don't want to go into that. I know you will try and bait me into it. I'm a veteran of this, so I will certainly not get into that. It is absolutely correct and appropriate for us to wait for what comes out tomorrow.
No, I agree. So I'm going to take the Pele pass and move on to the other subject. And let's talk about the piece of legislation that's just been cleared by Parliament, and that is the Privacy and Protection Bill that has gone through. While I'll address some of the specific concerns that have been raised with the bill, which is now an act, let's talk about the execution roadmap. What timelines are we talking about? Is it a question of months? Is it a question of a year or more? When are we actually going to see the digital platform? When will we see the board being set up? If you can give us some indication and insight on the execution roadmap.
So Shereen, thank you for congratulating me, even if you didn't say it. Thank you for congratulating the government for doing something which I believe is extremely foundational to our country's vision of an India Techade and $1 trillion digital economy. It's a very, very building block legislation that on one hand protects the rights for the first time, codifies the rights of our citizens, as well as creates a compliance framework that does not come in the way of innovation and growth. Look, on the issue of transition, we recognize in the government that it is certainly the bill and the act represents a transition from a current regime to an absolutely new regime. And the new regime of data protection is designed to create behavioral changes in the data platforms and data companies that process personal data of Indian citizens. And we certainly want it to be orderly. We certainly want the transition to be not disruptive for both consumers and the companies involved, including startups. So we will sit with the industry and work out a relatively reasonable transition period and a framework. Of course, you must understand there are two very competing pressures here. One is the industry saying, give us infinite time.
Okay.
And then our duty to the citizens to say that these rights that are now in the legislation should be available to you at the earliest. So these are effectively two opposite poles of the pulls and pushes. But we will sit with the industry, we will sit with consumer groups and work out a process and a time frame that will ensure at the heart of it that the entire transition is orderly. And I have already said this in public, and I suspect there will be 2 or 3 graded transition roadmaps, some for the more mature, larger tech companies who can afford and put resources to transition faster, and they make a bigger impact on our consumers. And some, maybe startups and some entities that are less digitized, take a little longer.
Okay, so you're talking about a graded rollout, one for the big tech and one for the startup ecosystem and the less evolved as far as the digital journey is concerned.
Correct.
But when you talk about a reasonable time frame, because you did explain to us the conflict, the pulls and pressures that you are dealing with, what would qualify as a reasonable time frame? Are we talking about 6 months, 12 months? What do we say?
I don't want to even suggest that I have a view on that. Nothing that we have done so far has been without consultation. We will certainly have deep, meaningful conversations with the industry, with the consumer groups, and evolve a framework. I don't want to say that I have a view on it or somebody else in the room has a view on it, and that's the view. We will work on this in an absolutely consultative manner, take views on board to understand what is required for an orderly transition, and we will go by that.
Okay, let me address some of the specific concerns with respect to what is now this Protection and Privacy Act. And I don't want to focus too much on just this because there's plenty more to talk about.
Sure.
But let me address some of the key concerns. One on the board itself and the composition of the board itself. In fact, Justice Sri Krishna has alluded to the fact that this could become, in fact, a captive board of the government. I know that you, as well as Minister Vaishnav, have equated this to something like SEBI, saying that, look, the government appoints the SEBI chairman, the tenure and so on and so forth. They're paid by the government as well. But how do you respond to this criticism and this concern that is being raised?
So first of all, I certainly don't want to necessarily explain every paranoid view of the legislation. I mean, there are things that I've heard that border on being reasonably absurd, saying this empowers a surveillance state, it grants unfettered powers to government, and certainly people are entitled to their views, but I certainly want to convey to your audience that this is a very well thought through, deeply consulted framework that has been built here. So none of this came out because we just woke up one day in the morning and said, let's draft a bill. Second is on the issue of the DPB, the Data Protection Board. I want to be very clear that the Data Protection Board's role in the bill is a very narrow role. It is not SEBI, it is not a regulator, it is not a statutory body. It's a body that adjudicates the dispute between those whose personal data have been given to a platform and the platform who has in turn breached the obligations under the law. It is simply, for want of a better word, it's an adjudicating body. Now, an adjudicating body's performance and accountability is going to be determined by its outcomes, its conduct, its results. And the DPB is a very digital organization. It will have tremendous amount of disclosure and transparency requirements. The appeals of the DPB lie in a TD SAT, which will be chaired by a retired Supreme Court judge. And the appeal there, the final appeal, lies in the Supreme Court. So therefore, the process that has been designed to ensure accountability and transparency will determine the efficacy and the performance of the DPP. Sitting today and having these over-imaginative views that this is a captive body and a not captive body is to do injustice to the group of people who will do this as a commitment to build an institution. The institution is going to be a very important institution to adjudicate disputes in the data economy for the next several years. And we have absolutely every intention to make this a high-quality, global standard, very credible institution. So our intentions, plus the fact that the design of the organization creates a lot of oversight on what it does and how it does, should today, for the moment, keep people confident about the direction that we are going in. And then, of course, down the road, if the DPP does not do a good job, everybody's entitled to his fair share of criticism.
When will we see the DPP being set up?
So I think in this transition period, a lot of these things have to be set up. The rules have to be enacted. The DPP has to be notified. We have to also ask for people to come and serve on the DPP. Yeah. As you know, we have openly signaled that we don't certainly want this to be an organization where there's only retired government or retired judges. We want young lawyers, we want youngsters to come in there and give 2, 3, 4, 5 years of their life to serve in these types of institutions that are modern, very fundamental institutions. And so we will see as we go along. I also have a challenge of bringing in talented people to serve there. So it's not just about designing, it's also about attracting good, committed, public service-oriented talent to serve there.
Fair enough. Let me address two of the other specific concerns. While there are many, I'll address just two more. One is with respect to the powers of blocking. Why did we need that to be part of this act? Because it was already under Section 69A of the IT Act. Why did you feel the need to bring it under this act as well?
So this blocking in this legislation is a very narrow blocking. It is for those who repeatedly violate the law. So if you read the construct there, if there is a platform that has breached the law, it gets penalized by the DPP once. Then if it does it again, it gets penalized again by the DPP. And we think that it's a good power to have to, in a sense, create a deterrent to a platform that may have figured out a way of gaming these penalties. To say that, look, it is not just that we will penalize you, but if you have repeated conduct of breaching the law, we also have the power to block you from the internet. We certainly don't want the internet to have players that are repeatedly violating the law. So that power is there in the government. Whether the government exercises it and what occasion does it exercise it, the government will decide.
CNBC-TV18 Digital India Vision 8.0 in partnership with Google Workspace.
Pyramid Technology